Good afternoon, everyone, Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. My name is Francesco Mancini. I'm an associate dean and associate professor here at the school, and I'm delighted to have been asked to moderate this conversation this afternoon. Before moving to Singapore 4 years ago, I was based in New York, and I worked for almost 14 years in and around the United Nations, so I'm particularly passionate around issues of global governance. So I'm very happy that today we can discuss about global governance, particularly finding solutions to revive and improve multilateralism. I want to thank the French Embassy to Singapore and His Excellency the Ambassador for bringing this opportunity to our school. Thank you very much. We have a fairly packed agenda, so I won't steal too much time in introducing the panelists. You have their bios. The only things I want to mention is that this initiative is building upon a new event that just concluded in Paris, the Paris Peace Forum, which I regrettably didn't attend, but I heard it was extremely successful. And the reason I want to mention that is because it was a global gathering that not only included governments, but included also the private sector as well as the civil society. And I think this is the new global governance. The new global governance is not just a business of governments. It includes also all parties in our societies. And I think that is yet another challenge in reforming our global institutions. Let's start with our speakers. I can't think of a better person to start and kick off our conversation than Professor Tommy Koh, who's an ambassador at large Singapore, but he also throughout his diplomatic career has dealt with global governance, global institutions at the highest level. So we really look forward to hear your thoughts on this topic. Professor Tommy, you have your floor. Thank you.
I think my wife will be able to think of any other better speaker than me. But when my good friend Ambassador Marc Abensour asked me, I cannot say no to him. And I think the context is that on the 11th of November this year, we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. And so I want to begin by taking this 100-year perspective and ask myself, what were the most important trends of development over the past 100 years? And I want to suggest to you that over the past 100 years, we have progress from the world in which might is right to a world governed imperfectly by the rule of law. We have progress from a world in which mighty nations act alone to a world in which all countries, big and small, cooperate with one another to achieve their shared objectives. We have moved from unilateralism to multilateralism or cooperation between and among many countries. We do not have world government and never will, but we have a system of multilateral institutions or international organizations spanning every field of human endeavor, which make our civilization possible. In fact, we cannot imagine life without it. So let me go on to my second point to try to convince you. Let me start with a simple example. We are all addicted to our mobile phones, yeah? But most people don't realize that mobile telephony would not be possible if we did not have an international organization called the International Telecommunication Union, which make this possible. So people forget that there is a framework, there's a legal political framework that make mobile telephony possible. The world economy would collapse if we did not have international trade. And we could not have international trade without international shipping, as well as international civil aviation. So I would say the world economy is being driven by trade, by shipping, by aviation. And we have three very important institutions to facilitate this. The WTO for trade, the International Maritime Organization based in London to facilitate safety at sea, and ICAO in Montreal to enable and facilitate international civil aviation. I'll give you another recent example. There was a controversy a few months back about whether chemical weapons have been used in Syria, and if so, by who. The disputing party turned to an international organization for help. And this is an international organization called OPCW, the International Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, based at The Hague, I believe. OPCW is an expert institution on chemical weapons. It is also trusted by everybody. And so the dispute between the party was able to be resolved by reference to this international organization, OPCW. I want to make the additional point this afternoon that all the global challenges that we face today, whether it's global warming and climate change, terrorism, the spread of pandemics, cyber crimes and cyber attacks, cannot be resolved unilaterally. These global challenges can only be resolved through international cooperation. We live in an interconnected world, and it is a world governed by a rule-based international order. Yeah, and I would say my second point that this is really important. I want to go on to my third and final point. My third and final point is that Asia and Europe must work together for multilateralism. Yeah, I hope my European and other friends will not be offended by my conceit if I were to say that Asia is on the rise. Yeah, Asia is on the rise. And that, as you know, in the past 40 years, China's share of the world economy has gone from 2% to 15%. And according to all the projections, the Chinese economy will soon surpass in size the American economy. But there are other Asian players also occupying a very significant place in the world economy. The third largest economy in the world today is Japan. Yeah, India is on the rise, and there are projections that suggest that in time to come, the largest economy in the world will be China, followed by America, followed by India, followed by Japan, and followed by ASEAN. Many of us from Southeast Asia underestimate our own significance. The ASEAN economy is today the 6th largest economy in the world, and the World Bank's projection is that by 2030, we will become the 4th largest economy in the world. So I want to say that the rise of the Asian countries over the past 40 years has been made possible by our hard work, sound policy, good governance, and a very supportive external environment. And by a supportive external environment, I mean an environment including open economies, free trade, globalization, the rule of law, and multilateralism. Multilateralism is of strategic importance. to Asian prosperity and security. So any threat to multilateralism is a threat to Asia. So I want to conclude by saying that at this important moment in world history, we need the leaders of Europe and Asia to stand shoulder to shoulder in defending multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Not only for reminding us the presence of many institutions that we kind of forget about, right? But they're actually behind a lot of how the world is run today, but also the strategic value, right, of this institution. Delighted now to pass the floor to His Excellency, the Ambassador of France to Singapore, for Marc Abensour. Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Today I would like, to seize the opportunity, to share with you some elements about the Paris Peace Forum, and then also try to explain why it is in Singapore and ASEAN interest, to team up with the EU to defend together the multilateralism. And then finally to give just a few illustrations of that. But first, Mr. Mancini, let me express my deep gratitude to the other panelists. I'm very pleased to have with us today Mr. Assaad Razzouk. Actually, Mr. Assaad Razzouk is the only one who attended the Paris Peace Forum, I'm sure, in this room. So your testimony, will be extremely precious. I'm also delighted, to have the opportunity to pursue our regular conversation on the EU-ASEAN dialogue with Dr. Yeo. And I wanted also to express a particular thank you to Ambassador Koh for taking the time of participating to this panel. I think that in time of uncertainties and geopolitical turbulence, it's extremely precious, to benefit from your very long experience. But also, what I want to emphasize is that you're someone of a very deep conviction, and that you have shown unwavering conviction and belief in support of multilateralism and international law. So you will be our diplomatic compass in this exercise. Going back to the Paris Peace Forum, so it coincided with the commemoration of the end of World War I, 11th of November. It's not by chance. And so it was the opportunity to get together 60 heads of state and governments across the globe, as well as leaders of the United Nations, WTO, IMF, OECD, World Bank. And I want to quote just one sentence of the French president's speech under the Arc de Triomphe, which is, "Will this be the resounding symbol of a lasting peace between nations, or a last moment of unity before the world darkens into a new disorder?" And it's not just to, over-dramatize it, but it's clear that we all keep in mind, how at the end of the World War I, France and Germany remained divided, and that less than 20 years afterwards, the war broke out again. It was also after the end of World War I that the international community invited the League of Nations, and it failed because of unilateralism, economic crisis, and nationalism. And so this idea, which presided to the Paris Peace Forum, is that there is actually urgency to organize ourselves and to support multilateralism. We are convinced, that there are some parallels between the present day and the period of the interwar during First World War and First World II. As I said, we can observe nationalism trends in terms of nationalism, populism, protectionism. There is increasing competition between great powers, and the multilateral organizations like the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions are under threat. And because there are some who are trying to undermine these multilateral institutions, and you can also note some self-isolation trends from some very key global actors. So what was the purpose of the Paris Peace Forum? It was to gather all the actors of global governance to strengthen the multilateral institution. And the starting point was that no state could act alone to resolve global problems, as just Ambassador Koh underlined. That working together, it's not an option, that it is the only answer, and that we need a world of rules, an open world and a multilateral world. And so the Paris Peace Forum was this opportunity to empower a global resistance of multilateralists against unilateralism and against transactional approach to foreign policy. I won't describe it into details. There were 5 different themes in the forum: development, environment, inclusive economy, new technologies, and peace and security. Just to give you some facts, there were attendees from governments, but also business, NGOs, foundations, media, and so on. And the important thing was that it was aimed at presenting very concrete projects to solve some key challenges in terms of international life. And so there were a selection of 119 global governance projects, and these originated from 42 different countries and 10 different international organizations. And at the end of the Paris Peace Forum, the principle was to select 10 out of the 119 projects to be supported afterwards and to be monitored. So the model which was used for the organization and of the Paris Peace Forum was the COP21 in Paris in 2015, which worked in a rather efficient way. And again, always with this idea, I mean, to put a focus on concrete solutions to some global challenges. So the Paris Peace Forum is not a summit. It's not. It's neither a conference, but it's the gathering of actors of global governance, bringing together governments and civic groups to debate and recommend concrete and collective solutions to global challenges, trans-border challenges, and to propose concrete solutions again. So the idea, if to put it in a nutshell, would be to have a kind of Davos of focused on the global governance. And clearly, it was oriented from the very beginning to the definition of rules. So I will just mention, I mean, just the title of 3 projects. There was one on the Partnership for Regional Ocean Governance, another one on Tax Inspectors Without Borders, a project supported by the OECD, another one called the Digital Peace Project, supported by Microsoft, which is an initiative for a safer digital world. And a note worth mentioning is that US tech giants were actually significantly present in the Paris Peace Forum. You had Google, Twitter, Facebook, and that was an interesting sign. It's too early to already share all the takeaways of the Paris Peace Forum and to draw the conclusions. What I wanted to do today is just to limit myself to share with you 3 considerations. The first is that the Paris Peace Forum, in a way, demonstrated that we can keep multilateral tools alive, even in US absence. So you are going to tell me immediately that it's not so much the case with the nuclear deal on Iran. Yes, but we have also to have in mind, that the Paris Agreement on climate is still developing in a rather positive and encouraging way. It's still supported by everyone who signed it in Paris in 2015, except one. And I think that it's a good example. Another example, it's the TPP at 12, which now has been reinvented in a different format. I forgot the acronym, but it's a TPP at 11. CPTPP. Okay, CPTPP. And I think it's telling us that it's possible, to keep international agreements alive beyond populism, beyond interstate tensions, and in the America's absence. And I'm sure that it can be done on other issues. The second consideration is that we very often consider that what works, it's the most inclusive approach. So the idea to put all the multi-stakeholders in the same room, and they will deliver, I mean, the real and needed solutions. And that the previous forum were excessively state-centered. I think it is absolutely necessary to have this multi-stakeholders approach. But at the same time, I think the Paris Peace Forum also conveyed the message that it should not lead to less political investment in multilateral institutions, and that the states remain some key actors. And so this is why I said first that it was oriented towards the definition of rules or regulations. I know that some immediately when you hear regulation, you think that it's extremely constraining, that it will hamper innovation and so on. But that was precisely a debate which developed under the auspices of the Paris Peace Forum. But our belief is that no, there is actually a need for regulation. I think that the example given by Ambassador Koh about your cell phone and the fact that it works because there is an international organization which provides the regulation, the rules of the game, it's absolutely relevant. And you can have that in different areas. The third consideration is that what is the response to unilateralism or protectionism, or actually what we see, which is the logic of sphere of influence of great powers. There is a temptation, which is to respond to that by building coalition. And actually, we see this. Let me just mention one example with the Indo-Pacific concept. There is this idea that in that framework, I mean, you could have the Quad as an instrumental format. And the Quad, basically, it's a coalition. We don't exactly, I mean, fully measure what it does cover. But I'm using this example just to say that what does it mean? That we are moving towards a multipolar world with different coalitions based on principles which are not fully clear or well defined, and which can develop actually in the long run at the expense of the multilateral system. The other problem with coalitions is that it's not the most effective way to proceed in the international life, because most of the time these coalitions are not built on common values. And so the cooperation can remain rather limited. It can work in one area, but you immediately, I mean, are confronted to some limits. And so we see, I mean, this, I said, a temptation or this trend to move from hub and spoke order to a power of grid in which networks and links, I mean, will get even more important, but at the expense of some institutional, multilateral institutions. So these were just three considerations that I wanted to share with you. Now my point is that during the Paris Peace Forum, there was a limited participation of Asian countries. So actually India, Thailand, Cambodia were represented at a political level. But what is important is that there was quite a substantial participation of Asian associations and companies. And actually, among the 119 projects which were selected, 18 were coming from Asia. So as I said, I want to seize this opportunity to extend my speech going beyond the Paris Peace Forum, using this as an opportunity to explain why it is in Singapore and ASEAN interest, I mean, to collaborate further with the EU and in this multilateral agenda. Here in Southeast Asia, I mean, clearly we are confronted to growing competition between the US and China. I think that Southeast Asia has managed pretty well to build the ASEAN as a way to gain space and to develop some diplomatic tools to guarantee its autonomy. But clearly, there is a feeling of, I mean, Southeast Asians are feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the possibility of having to choose between China and India. And recall, I mean, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong saying
China and
that...
US. China and US.
China and US, what did I say?
China and India.
Sorry, China and US. Thank you very much.
We also don't
I don't want to open
China
new avenues of uncertainties. And so I recall what Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said about that may come a time when ASEAN may have to choose between US and China. What is important is that what he said just afterwards, which is it's very desirable not to have to take sides. And I think that ASEAN, of course, I mean, is the platform to gain room of maneuvers. But in the current context, I mean, there is this tendency by great powers to build spheres of influence and to undermine, I mean, the credibility of multilateral institutions. And so this is why a deepened partnership between Singapore, EU, ASEAN, EU is more necessary than ever. And I know it doesn't come to mind immediately, because very too often we think that the Singapore, EU, ASEAN, EU agenda is very much about trade, and that trade is the most important item in the agenda. This is the common perception. And on that side, I mean, we are very pleased that Singapore and EU eventually signed the FTA agreement last month in Brussels. It shows also that together we can stand against the tide of protectionism. But I think the agenda should be expanded to other issues, and Dr. Yeo will probably elaborate on that, but it should be on security, and I'm, of course, the fight against terrorism. We are actually facing the same enemies, the foreign fighters leaving the Middle East and some moving to Central Asia and then Southeast Asia, others moving to Europe. It should be also on global issue with climate change and also on connectivity with a focus on digital connectivity and digital governance of the internet. So let me just elaborate on one specific area where we could do much more between Singapore and the EU and ASEAN. It's on the cybersecurity and governance of the internet. And then I will come back to the Paris Peace Forum. We consider that it's absolutely crucial to develop common principles to build trust and stability on the internet. And so there is clearly a need for the global community to agree on appropriate regulation. Otherwise, there is a risk for the integrity of our institutions. And currently, on the internet, you have two sides. You have authoritarian governments who exert strict control, and you have also some democratic countries, but who let anyone compromise the system. So to put it in a very blunt way, excessively simplified way, I would say you have internet for control or internet for cash. And you have actually these two models with, on one side, I mean, a complete self-management without any governance. And it's ruled by, I would say, the private actors of the internet. And on another side, a compartmented internet entirely monitored by authoritarian states. So our belief is that there is a third way. And during the Paris Peace Forum, we hosted the Internet Governance Forum, which is a UN forum. And here again, you see, I mean, the importance of multilateral institutions. And so the French president launched what is called now the Paris Call to support an open, secure, stable, accessible, and peaceful cyberspace. So it's a call in favor of a rules-based cyberspace where international law applies, and there is a specific mention of the UN Charter, and where fundamental freedoms and human rights are respected. And that would be the result of a collaboration of three actors, of course, states, but also private companies and civil society. So for the time being, this call has been supported by 51 states, 90 non-profit groups, and 130 private corporations. Absent from the signing are China, Russia, US, Iran, Israel. And we think that it remains, I mean, open to other states or private actors and representatives from the civil society. So I think that it would be interesting also for ASEAN countries, I mean, to consider the possibility to join and support the Paris call on the internet governance. Actually, just to mention it, on a bilateral basis between Singapore and France, we have adopted at the highest level during PM Lee Hsien Loong's visit to France last July as a guest of honor of the French president for the French National Day, a roadmap on digital innovation, cybersecurity, and governance of the internet. And this is very much in line, I mean, with the 9 key principles laid out in the Paris Call on the governance of the internet. So I will stop here, but just to say that, and to put it in a provocative way, that the geography, I mean, put us very far away, but in the current time, we should not give in to geography, because the giving in to geography makes, I mean, useful for the game, I mean, developed by those who want to grow sphere of influence, and we should stick together to the consolidation and strengthening of multilateral institutions. So in a sense, I mean, the most important strategic partner nowadays of ASEAN countries, it's the EU. And so I'm sure that in the coming ministerial meeting of a foreign minister next January between EU and ASEAN, there will be an opportunity to highlight, I mean, this perspective. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for giving us a bit of insights on the Paris Peace Forum, but also to give some key highlights on an agenda for multilateralism, concrete points of action. Thank you very much. So I'm sure we're now continuing along those lines with Dr. Yeo Lay Hwee, who is the director of the European Union Center here in Singapore. Dr. Hwee, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and a very good afternoon to all of you. I would like to thank the French Embassy for inviting me to share the podium with my mentor and role model, Professor Koh. But I would like also first, if I may, to contradict you a little bit on the ranking of the global economies. We always say that the EU has always been neglected. True. And you mentioned that China was number 2 after US, but I would say that actually it's the EU as the second largest economy after the US. And in fact, sometimes, depending on the ups and downs of the stocks and all that, it could be the largest bloc actually and the largest economy in the world. So that's, and second, I thought I shared Ambassador's point that the world should not be organized according to the poles or the spheres of influence, because a multipolar world connotes the idea that it's organized along power, different poles, different power sphere of influence. And we should actually work more towards a multilateral world, multilateralism, which is built on interests and principles. And I think this is where I know this multilateralism has been challenged, but I would like to be a little bit more optimistic that I think multilateralism will survive, as I think our speakers, the 2 speakers before me have mentioned. We are in a very interdependent, interconnected world. I think there's no other choice. And with the kind of diffusion of power, with the fact that there's a diversity of many actors, of course it's a challenge. Global governance is a challenge. But it also means that it's not easy to impose that kind of hegemony that the US thought it could do sometimes in the unipolar world just after the post-Cold War era. So I think that multilateralism as under crisis or sort of under challenge is actually not new. If you remember back in 2003 when the Americans went to war in Iraq despite a lot of reservations, right? Analysts would say that the first crisis of the multilateralism emerged in the post-Cold War era when the world moved from a bipolar world to a brief unipolar moment enjoyed by the US. So there was skepticism towards multilateralism, in the sense that you have this hegemon, the unipolar movement of the Americans, and supported, of course, sometimes as the Western allies that brought about threat to a multilateral order. But, as an academic, I'm an academic, so I have to begin also by defining what we meant by multilateralism. Multilateralism is often associated with multilateral cooperation in an era of interdependence. In a globalized, interdependent world, multilateralism is seen as an important organizing principle to help us overcome coordination problems and increase ability to address common challenges and solve transnational problems. Multilateralism as an organizing principle, as offered by, I think, a Harvard professor and who used to work in the UN, John Ruggie, who has also taught at the Columbia University, say that it's in an ideal rule-based open system where principles should take precedence over interests. That's his ideal type of multilateralism. So Ruggie's idealistic conceptualization of multilateralism is built on principles that distinguish it from unprincipled real politics and political pragmatism. His principled multilateralism, unfortunately, is flawed in the real world because in some way it did not recognize that institutions are important, but they are not antidotes to power. In the real world, power matters, right? And so, in fact, institutions themselves can be hijacked for power contests. And I think that is his flaw when he conceptualized his idealistic form of multilateralism. Unfortunately, we know in the real world, power politics do not disappear. We want to try and manage it, but it will not disappear. And cooperation has to be based on interests and not purely on principles. So I think we need to focus on multilateralism built based on shared interests. Principles are important, but we've got to exercise some sort of flexibility in that, because I think in the end, we've got to be pragmatic. So we need to distinguish between multilateralism as a principal form of behavior in international relations and the growth and operation of a lot of international organizations as a centerpiece of multilateralism in policy practice. In a lot of these multilateral institutions that work, there's a certain recognition of the power principle. If you think of the EU itself, if you have a qualified majority voting, you have the fact that there's the Franco-German engine. In that sense, there need to be both recognition of power and responsibility, but at the same time balancing the interests and taking care of the interests of smaller states. I think in that kind of multilateral institutions that recognize the power differences, and if you design in that way, I think it can work better than to entirely think that power doesn't matter. During the Cold War period, the US as the hegemon was primarily institutionalist. It was never really a multilateralist. So when the US took on the lead in building multilateral institutions such as NATO and the Bretton Woods institutions, the injunction to behave multilaterally always applied more to the junior partners in these organizations, right, than the hegemon itself. This institutional bargain, underwritten by a combination of US power and resources, enlightened self-interest, and liberal values, allowed the creation of a set of institutions providing for collective goods that are acceptable to the US and its allies. But since the post-Cold War era, the US, because of its predominance, has adopted an essentially ad hoc approach towards multilateralism. And then, of course, now under Trump, even this ad hoc or more instrumental approach towards multilateralism is further threatened. But to me, it's not only Trump. I think the rise of populist politicians who think in parochial nationalist dimensions with zero-sum mentality rather than win-win cooperation is further undermining the support for multilateralism in policy practices. So what should and can the EU and ASEAN do in response to these challenges to multilateralism posed by the US, and of course the assertiveness of autocratic powers like China and Russia? I think the US has sometimes, the EU has sometimes been chided for lacking a strategic vision and for being too dependent on the US for its security. Of course, that is changing under Trump, and we have here German leader and French leader talking about needing to take destiny into their own hands. But the question for the EU is that in the face of Trump, with his disregard for allies and alliances and his America First policy, whether the EU would be able to act with other partners to restrain and limit the damage of US actions. And here, I think Ambassador has given us assurance that the EU is really looking for like-minded partners to work together to really underpin and support the multilateral system. So the question, of course, in the minds of some is, can the EU really fill the void of this lack of US leadership and propel multilateral approaches to sustain a rule-based order? I think for the EU to assume more responsibility and work with other like-minded partners to sustain a multilateral rule-based order, the EU must urgently also overcome its own internal challenges and divisions. I think that is crucial. Without unity, and I think it's also very clear in the 2016 EU global strategy that unity is the most important. If the EU is united and can be coherent in its strategic vision, then it could assume much more responsibility and play an important role in supporting the rule-based order. The EU also has to rethink whether it wants to double down on its earlier doctrine of effective multilateralism. We know this word effective multilateralism was in the 2003 European Security Strategy, which essentially amounts to support for legally binding commitments agreed upon by the largest number of nations, made possible through institutionalized cooperation. Is this the kind of multilateralism that you think can still work? Or should it shift towards a more flexible platform for cooperation that recognizes the geopolitical realities of today? In short, how to conceive of multilateralism that can better accommodate the diversity of players. And here we talk about also non-state actors and their different interests, and provide for more flexibility in the design. So we talk about the 2016 EU Global Strategy. I think there was a talk about principled pragmatism. How do we really operationalize that and turn and conceive of multilateral institutions that really that is pragmatic to something, but underlying certain principles, fundamental principles. I think in the face of the rising nationalist tide that we see, while one should not give in to xenophobia and ultra-nationalism, I think there should be more recognition of the attachment to sovereignty that many of these populist politicians are able to garner the support of his followers, and to be more accepting of voluntary commitments rather than legalistic obligations as a basis for multilateral cooperation. And I think in some way, if you look at how ASEAN work, it is based on this kind of voluntary commitments, and that may be somehow some lessons to be learned. I think for ASEAN, multilateralism has always been a very amorphous concept, very unclear. It is built on the idea of ASEAN centrality. And of course, based on the self-restraint of the big powers. When the big powers are more self-restrained, ASEAN could play a role and be given the role as so-called in the driving seat. So ASEAN has always emphasized the principle of inclusivity with minimum norms and maximum flexibility. However, now that you have major powers such as the US and China, we talk about not wanting to choose sides, acting without much self-restraint or consideration at all for smaller players like ASEAN, what should ASEAN do, I think, to maintain its centrality? And again, ASEAN's challenge here, unlike the EU, is really to move away maybe from the maximum flexibility to try and institutionalize the voice of smaller powers and allow for more effective collective action. So I think EU and ASEAN has a lot to learn from each other. I think both the EU and ASEAN can support each other to garner the political will and exercise collective leadership to reform and improve on our existing multilateral institutions, and also build new complementary inter-regional regimes that can be building blocks towards global governance. So the two regions really can do a lot together. If the EU and ASEAN, these two regional entities comprising more than 1 billion people, can work towards practical solutions to common challenges, such as whether it's on climate change, trade and sustainable development, counter-terrorism and cybersecurity that the ambassador mentioned, I think it would have made an important contribution to regional and global governance. And it will be a concrete showcase of how multilateralism built on mutual and shared interests is a way forward towards a new world order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Triggered so many thoughts, I think, in all of us. Very interesting points in this interplay between power, interest, and values, and I think that's actually fundamental when we think about multilateralism. And personally, I think that the UN Charter has done quite a good job in managing these three relationships, much better than the previous institution that Ambassador actually reminded us, the League of Nations. Now to our fourth speaker, Mr. Assaad Razzouk. So as you heard, Assaad was actually present at the forum, and he presented a particular project related to the issue of climate change. And Mr. Razzouk is the Group Chief Executive of the Sindicatum Sustainable Resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very good of you to have me here. So I'm not an academic, and I'm not a diplomat. And I think most of the conversation is slightly above my pay grade. So I'm going to just try and bring it back to kind of the world where I sit. I think the best way to, maybe remember my contribution when you leave is to think about me as a pissed off clean energy entrepreneur. Now, why am I pissed off, and why did I go to the Paris Peace Forum? I'm pissed off because basically my view is that the biggest existential threat to world peace is climate change. And we are not doing much about it at all. It's kind of falling between it's the forgotten problem by and large. It's getting worse. The data is very clear because emissions keep rising. So at the same time, it's the perfect example of something that requires collective action because none of us can do much on their own to fight that kind of a global problem. I'm also a Singapore headquartered company, and part of the pissed off reason is that ASEAN is probably the laggard on climate change action worldwide, almost by any metric. So we are really doing the least possible we can in our contribution to fight climate change, and I'm talking about the 10 ASEAN states collectively. So our collective action really here has been quite awful. And, the IPCC released a wonderful report in October that basically outlines quite clearly what needs to be done. And it says, for example, one of the key levers we can actually exercise is to move renewables up to 60 or 70% of power by 2030, with a total decarbonization by 2050. And again, looking at it from an ASEAN perspective, we're probably the worst in the world in actually getting anywhere near those targets. Now then, back in February, I became aware that there is this thing called the Paris Peace Forum, which is about to be born as an annual event in Paris to coincide in its first edition with the end of World War I. When we took a look at it, in detail, we saw that it was really an opportunity for both a top-down but also a bottom-up approach to a problem, which so far in the last few decades hasn't really featured in any of the global things that you tend to go to. So if you go to Munich, if your concern is security, you go to Munich. Then if it's money, you go to Davos. Then if it's climate, you go to the climate talks. But peace was forgotten, and thankfully the French, actually put a lot of diplomatic effort behind pulling a Paris Peace Forum off the ground from really nothing just a few months ago, and having in it both 70, I think the number at the end was more like 70 heads of states or their representatives, plus a very wide collection of non-governmental organizations, private corporations, and other governance bodies from around the world. It was done at in an area, in a place in Paris called La Villette, which is a big hall that used to be a vegetable market, which I thought was quite, appropriate given the climate issues we're facing. So, and then it was very egalitarian because small companies, NGOs, and Facebook and Google all had a very small stand of exactly the same size. And over the course of 2 or 3 days, we had the opportunity to do discussions, debates, pitches, and networking in a semi-structured way to basically socialize, for everybody to socialize their projects, and get as much maybe impetus behind it as possible in that type of environment. And the first day, the heads of state joined in a hall with the rest of us, where we had speeches by the presidents of France, the Chancellor of Germany, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, with after that all of these diplomatic groups basically going around the hall to look at the various stands, with the ability to approach them and talk to them if you thought that would help. So there was different views on how much, from a bottom-up perspective, it would help to speak to the head of state, but I think we all tried our best. Now, we were the only Singaporean company there, which was a little bit strange, I have to say. We were there because we had a small project that basically aims to digitize renewable energy globally. And by digitizing it, we are hoping that we can drive $100 billion of additional finance into renewables worldwide in order to try and close that gap between where we are today and where we need to be. I think, the Paris Peace Forum was only in its first edition. We have to wait and see how it develops. The climate COPs, we're on edition 15 or 16, I think. I can tell you, though, that the food was better than the climate COPs. So that's what happens when you host it in France. I blame, my colleagues going to the COP in Katowice in a couple of weeks because they won't get that luxurious treatment. And we tried hard, from that forum to basically make a small contribution towards the debate that was going on about the governance, peace, and the structures that are needed to effectively enhance what we have, while at the same time trying to shout from the roofs effectively in a message about how much more ASEAN needs to do to pull its weight, because I heard of its weight economically and maybe diplomatically, but in terms of the climate change contribution, it's way off, I think, what it needs to be. So there's a lot more to be done. I think I'll stop there before getting too excited about the topic, and hand it back to our chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. No, actually, we appreciated your passionate call. So it's a good way to wrap up the panel presentation and to open to the floor. We have a good 20 minutes, so I wonder if we maybe can take 2 or 3 questions and then revert to the panel. If you can just briefly introduce yourself. I wonder if there are microphones that will reach you. Is there anybody who can carry a microphone? I guess that will be me. Okay.
I think we can hear them. We can hear.
We can hear? Is that okay? Okay, please. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much to the panel for your interesting insights. I'm Hazim. I had the honor and privilege of actually attending Paris Peace Forum, not as a project leader to propose, but more of a participant to represent my non-profit. But the key question I had when I was there was there was actually very few ASEAN representatives, and actually going around and not really looking at seeing like people from ASEAN just hit me that why was there a clash between ASEAN summit dates as well as Paris Peace Forum dates? Because if I'm not wrong, ASEAN summit was 11 to 15 November and Paris Peace Forum was 11 to 13. So if ASEAN is truly a key player, why did the summit clash with Paris Peace Forum?
Okay. We might need a global institution to coordinate calendars at the global level. Thank you.
World War I, unfortunately, happened to clash
With the ASEAN.
and so they couldn't do anything about that.
Thank you. Please.
I think that's a really important point, and I think it's something that we all really struggle with when it comes to a very, very packed international agenda. You're trying to schedule multiple forums across multiple times, and don't forget that the Bloomberg New Economy Forum was also just a few days before all this, and there were some very significant things that happened there. I just want to say congratulations to France for the initiative. I'm delighted, Ambassador, that you raised the issue of cybersecurity. I think that's a very important thing. I can't let you get off the stage without really encouraging you to transmit the message back to the European Commission that they have a seat at the table at APEC's Electronic Commerce Steering Group, but they haven't shown up for 5 years. So when you talk about trying to come together and get multilateral cooperation around a critical set of issues, when you have a seat at the table, I think it's really incumbent to use that. So can't let you get away without that. Lay Hwee, I thought you had a really important framing that's of value in trying to move this discussion forward in how you characterize multilateralism and talking about multilateralism based on shared interests. There's a great risk in this current environment that you're in one camp or not, or in the other camp. But in fact, our interests are going to diverge depending on the particular issue. And I think there's a lot of things that ASEAN and the EU can agree on, but there are some issues we are going to fundamentally disagree that we just cannot get along with. If those are make or break issues, it will really stop the game before it even starts. So let me urge some sort of flexibility, and I guess in the words of the former Singaporean Prime Minister, the need to practice this flexible geometry and variable boundaries. That's absolutely critical, but we need to think through a little bit more what are the most important institutions for dealing with particular issues, and think of the variable geometry to implement that effectively. And Mr. Razzouk, just to give you a little bit of hope, every time we have a discussion in my organization about climate change, it's always the youth that care the most about this issue. The old guys, forget it. So it should give you some hope that the younger generation in the region do think that climate change is terribly important. They just got to wait for the rest of us to get out the way.
So I noticed that I'm Tzu Feng, and I'm studying at Yale NUS College and NUS Law. So I noticed that the speeches focus on whether multilateralism is important. But I can't help that maybe that's not the focus, right? Rather the focus is the form of multilateralism. Because one can argue that it is precisely the failures of post-war multilateralism that led to the present problems that we are facing, namely like unilateralism and populism. And that, for example, the issues of free trade promoted by economic institutions like the World Trade Organization has led to economic inequality, as well as the rise of populists, and also even the institution of the European Union, right, has actually partly contributed to Brexit and to perhaps nationalist sentiments in many European countries within the EU. So I'm just wondering whether the challenges facing basically existing multilateral institutions as well as multilateralism has to be understood in relation to its failures. And I'm just wondering, what do you all think about it? Yeah.
I share his concern regarding ASEAN, which has set quite low targets in terms of committing to renewable energy. I attended the Singapore International Energy Week and was hopeful with the new arrangement that IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, has committed to work with ASEAN to try and drive renewable investment. But there still seems to be a lack of both media attention to it and government attention to address this. I'm also aware that there are a number of companies like Syndicatum, Assaad's company, that is investing currently in renewable energy in the region, but they're getting practically no attention from government or media as to what they are doing. And it's because I think investing in renewables doesn't take the multi-billion dollars that's needed. It can be done in small lots. So I'd like certainly other members of the panel to address what can be done to both lift ASEAN's commitment to climate change and introducing renewables, and to see whether some greater influence can be brought to bear. The European Union certainly provides an excellent example, and I think we could learn a lot from the way Europe has adopted renewables.
I want to know which country do you think is...
Can you speak louder?
Yeah, okay. I'm wondering which country is the biggest threat to the multilateralism? Okay, it seems it's the US.
The answer is obvious, right?
Yeah, okay, but
why do you ask a rhetorical question?
No, it seems it's the US. Because I googled, okay, Chinese government, Chinese leaders, now we say we are the big, we strongly support multilateralism. But do you believe that?
Sorry?
Do you believe Chinese government's statement? You know, we are the real defender of the multilateralism.
Okay, so is Chinese commitment to multilateralism real, and do you believe that? Okay, so I think we have enough here to react. There were a couple of specific questions, but overall broad observations. So you want to?
No, maybe just on the dates. Yes, it was identified. I mean, issue from the beginning. I mean, as Assaad Razzouk said, he had no choice about the commemoration of the 100th anniversary, and it was really making sense. I mean, to combine both the Paris Peace Forum with this for all the reasons that I have developed. But there was ministers from different ASEAN countries which were invited to some events. There were a few Singaporean ministers invited to the forum on the governance of the internet. We knew that they could not participate to it, but we shared everything in advance, and we continue also to collaborate on this with the Singaporean part. I think that your question about I mean, the situation that we are facing nowadays, is it actually the result of the failure of the multilateral system? It's completely irrelevant the question. And of course, yes, to a certain extent. And so I think this is the reason why there are two answers to that. First, which is to lay out a strategy, a vision for some multilateral institutions. And it is the case within the EU. And I'm referring, for instance, to the vision which has been presented by the French president during what is called the Sorbonne speech. So some perceived it as an excessively ambitious vision. But I think it was, from the very beginning, I mean, everyone was aware that it was extremely ambitious. And that at the end you will not, I mean, fulfill all the objectives which were laid out during this speech. But it was this idea that you need, I mean, you need support, I mean, from the public opinion, and you need for that, I mean, to have people feeling excited about it, and that was something missing within the EU. I mean, it's true, if you ask people about the EU, it's not something that they feel really excited about it, because it's perceived as very technocratic and so on. So it's very important to lay out a vision. It's the case, for instance, on European defense. It's difficult to share a common strategy among the Europeans, but now it's even more the case. And the discussion which happened about the European military European army. I mean, of course, we can consider that it's far away, but clearly it does reflect something, which is that there is now a growing awareness that the strategic autonomy of the EU should be built, including on a military basis. So the vision, and second, and I think it's what we try to present, it's that it's not the multilateral institutions which will reform themselves. So they need input from private sector, from civil societies, and that's exactly, I mean, the kind of experiment which was done during the Paris Peace Forum. So, as we said, I mean, yes, we need Facebook, Google at the table, but at the same time, we consider that these private companies are not able, even if they are just platforms, to set the rules, which could be approved and supported by the whole international community.
I want to respond to 3 questions. The question from the student from Yeo Lay Hwee College: has multilateralism failed? The second question: can ASEAN do more for clean and renewable energy? And the third question: do we believe that China is committed to multilateralism? So, question 1: multilateralism has not failed. If you take a long perspective, the long period following the end of World War II until now, if we did not have this multilateral, inclusive, open order, the countries in Asia would not have risen so far and so fast, you know? I mean, we were very poor countries 50 years ago, and many of us have made it to middle-income country, high-income country. All this would not have been possible if we didn't enjoy this external environment based on open economy, free flow of goods, services, technology, talent, and so on, right? So multilateralism has not failed. However, within countries, in Europe and America, we've seen a new phenomenon, the phenomenon of the angry voter. Why are there so many angry voters in Europe and America? Because many of these voters feel that they have not benefited from the prosperity of their country. Many of them feel that they feel threatened by change and technology. Many of them feel threatened by immigrants. Many of them feel that the inequality in the countries have become obscene, you know? So this is a different phenomenon within countries from the global picture of multilateralism. My argument would be that the post-World War II multilateral order has been very successful. Yeah. The question, can ASEAN do more for clean and renewable energy? Absolutely yes. You know, we haven't done enough, and we should set much more ambitious targets. I've been persuading my own government to be more ambitious. We can raise the percentage of our energy from solar, which is now happening, you know, and solar energy is now commercially competitive with other forms of energy. In many ASEAN countries, they have other sources of clean energy. They have wind, they have hydro, they have geothermal. So the ASEAN country as a grouping ought to embrace more passionately than we have in the past clean and renewable energy, and we should set more ambitious targets. The last question is China, do we believe in China's commitment to multilateralism? I think most of us would say yes, but if you ask the United States, they'll say no. Yeah. Yeah. I think the American narrative, you know, and Sun Chi, I must warn you that this is not just Trump, it's not just a Republican, but there's a new American consensus that China has not abided by the rules, that China has taken advantage of the system to become rich and powerful at the expense of other countries such as the United States. So as you know, the American narrative by Vice President Pence, for example, at the APEC meeting in Port Moresby a few days ago, is that China has prospered at US expense because You have stolen American intellectual property rights. You've forced American companies to transfer technology, and you've not given American company access to the Chinese market. So there's this American narrative which worries me, you know. So if you ask me, and I hope I'm not being alarmist, but in my view, a new Cold War between the United States and China has begun. And I will even give you the date. It began on the 4th of October 2018. Why 4th October 2018? It is a day on which Vice President Mike Pence delivered that fierce anti-China speech to the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, we watched it.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, I'll pass you this.
I will take the question about whether multilateralism has failed too, because I think that's an interesting question. Again, I think, Prof. Koh's idea. I don't think it has failed, but because the conditions has changed, so we need to rethink how to revise or improve on those institutions as we go along, because multilateralism, again, was conceived based on state actors as the primary actors. But we're also moving into the world where there are much more diverse, many more diverse actors, and where power is diffused from states to non-state actors and all that. And with that kind of diversity, I think we really need to rethink how to make these institutions much more efficient, because I think as the number of players increase, as we become more diverse, I think the idea that multilateralism can deliver on efficient, effective solutions have been challenged. And I think that's where we need to focus our attention, how to reform this. And of course, again, we also talk, as I mentioned in my speech, I think multilateral institutions themselves can also be hijacked. If you have powers talking about commitment to multilateral, it can be hijacked by major powers. And if that happens again, then it leads to dysfunction. And when that happens again, we have to rethink how do we reform these institutions or create new ones or new regimes in order to solve some of these problems. To Ed's question, I think about interest, I think there's no other way you can organize it unless it's based on interest, because and I think here, of course, I don't think interest varies. I think all of us, for instance, would say that we have an interest in reducing poverty, right? But I think the priorities are different. Where do you put it as the most important? And I think it's not that the interests do not diverge, but the priorities, and how do you accommodate the differences in priorities, I think is important. And that's where I argue about the flexibility, the commitment, the time commitment. I think even within the EU, sometimes you allow, or within, for instance, ASEAN, we allow the CMLB to reach their commitments in a later time frame, for instance. So I think that kind of flexibility built in to this kind of multilateral institutions, I think can be hopeful. Then the other thing I wanted to add is also when you talk about we tend to think of, again, organizing things according to power, but in our concept in the 1990s, when we talk about East Asian regionalism, we always say that East Asian regionalism cannot be led by powerful countries, right? It has to be led by weak countries. And the only way it can work is through functional leadership rather than power leadership by who is biggest and who is strongest, but to lead through functional leader. And like you talk about variable geometry, you talk about multilateralism, gathering a group of countries that are passionate about finding solutions to certain common challenges, and let them lead this group. And I think that kind of thinking again along functional leadership for functional multilateralism again is a way to think through some of these issues.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just say, look, all these questions are great. I would encourage you to think of them in the context of the Paris Peace Forum. So any of these questions can actually be turned into a project. You can then do what we did, submit your project next year, and then go off and mobilize that the multi-stakeholders in that forum to help solve the issue that you've raised, whether it's
it's multilateralism in China, or climate, or peace and security, or any ASEAN issues. I think that's what the Paris Peace Forum is, in the sense that it's a governance platform to solve exactly these types of questions and put resources behind their solution. Thank you.
Wonderful. What a great way to conclude, with a call to action to solve a lot of the issues that we raised. So I wanted to thank you very much again, the French Embassy, for bringing this very interesting conversation to our school. And thank you to all our panelists. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you again for being, and thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.